Okay, my name is John Winkelman. I've been living in Grand Rapids since about 1990. Before that, I lived in Springport, Michigan, grew up on a dairy farm, and moved up here for college.
And where'd you go to college?
Grand Valley State University, which was Grand Valley State College at the time. My degree was in liberal studies with an emphasis in Russian studies. I was just a couple of credits shy of getting a major in Russian studies and ran out of time and money. What initially drew me was a project we had in high school, which was making a piece of art based on a poem, and it was a random grab bag of poems. And the one I chose was one called The Stump, which was written, I think, in the early 1900s, late 1800s by Hugh Sykes Davies. And it's kind of almost a prose poem, and it was strange enough and vivid enough that it really stuck with me. And then, of course, there was everything else you pick up in, a small school in the 80s. Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, The Raven, poems like that, Shakespeare. And then in college, I had the very good fortune of my freshman year having Lee Upton as one of my professors. And that she had us write a lot of poetry for English 170. And that really kind of opened the doors. Not that I really did anything with it at the time, but it really planted the seed. It's kind of a humorous poem. It's about a meditation on an old stump in the woods, and like the water that collects in it and the leaves that slowly turn to lace, and you don't want to reach down in it, because you reach down in it because, and then every stanza it's a little more grotesque and a little more grotesque about the things you might find if you reach down in the stump. And then it ends with you'll something like, and you can scrub and scrub your arm, but you'll never feel clean again. And for I'd never read anything like that, as 16-year-old me, who was usually reading fantasy and science fiction and whatever was available. And it just stuck. I could probably piece the poem together given enough time to think about it out of memory. Mm-hmm. Well, in Schuler Books, I was surrounded by poets for the first time. And that took a little getting used to because once again, coming from, genre fiction as my main interests. But I became fast friends with Scott Krieger, who worked there, and Christine Stevens at the time. And there was an ongoing series of poetry readings. And when I had time, I would sit in and listen to them. And, it was like this was just after college, and, me being at loose ends and not really knowing what I was doing with my life. And that kind of made poetry accessible because this was the first time outside of college, outside of the classroom, and outside of reading the great books that I'd heard poetry from a poet who was alive, both still alive and really good. And it wasn't, just reciting something because you'd been assigned to write a poem, but something that came from the heart, something that was written because it needed to be written. And so between that as an experience and also all these poets who were saying, here, you've got to read this. If you liked what we read, read this. So Scott turned me on to a book-length poem by Evan Connell called Notes from a Bottle Found on the Beach at Carmel, which I think I still have my original copy. It's read to pieces. But it's a book, it's just a meditation on the ills of the world, but it's told in disconnected, short, 1-sentence, 2-sentence, 3-sentence stanzas. And it's not really about anything at any given moment, but putting the whole thing together, it creates this mosaic that's just an astonishing piece of work. And Scott and I talked about it a fair bit, going back and forth over the years we worked together. And of course, that opened so many doors for the possibilities of what words could do. Well, almost anything you want them to, given enough effort and enough focus. We've in the years since, like, I started keeping a journal right about the same time I started working at the bookstore, or just before then, and that's where most of my poetry starts. Then again, most of what starts there stays there, and it never goes anywhere else. But when I'm writing, when I'm keeping the journal, which I still do, 30 years later, it's just thinking about what's going on today, how it is affecting me, what the relationship is between what happened today and what went on before, and if there's a seed in there so that I can write something a little more creative to help kind of make sense of things, or if it hits me at an emotional level and I need to explore that. It's very much like having a little moment of therapy every morning. So I can take these things that are in my head and put them down on paper and look at them from, in a somewhat objective point of view, just not quite as subjective as letting things bounce around inside my head. And sometimes it's oh, there's this beautiful thing that happened, I want to capture it, or there's this terrible thing that happened and I need it out of my head, so that I can approach the rest of my day with some kind of emotional stability. Or sometimes it's just a seed, and I'm just going to plant it there and see what comes of it as the day progresses or as the weeks progress. Mostly it's in the morning, during the weekdays before work. I get up early, exercise a little, and that's the only time of day when I have a discrete chunk of time where I'm reasonably sure to not be interrupted. Because it's one thing. Having a chunk of time where you're not interrupted is great. Having a chunk of time where you're not going to be interrupted is even better. And I could try that in the evenings, but I'd have to stay up really late. And that's the time I spend, with my partner. And I don't want to place my creative pursuit above, our relationship, because that's just kind of selfish. So back in 2014, I was part of a writers group that had been around for quite a while. I was the new person and everybody else knew each other. And I joined right at the time when some of the other people in there had got the idea that they wanted to start a publishing company, just out of the blue and just coincidentally. I'd been part of the poetry scene in Grand Rapids off and on since the early 90s. I'd started writers groups back in the 90s. I had worked in a bookstore. I had worked on the ordering side of things. I've basically done everything except get published or be a publisher. So when they said, is anybody else interested? I kind of said, well, maybe I can do some editing or something. And then when they found out how much experience I'd had in other aspects, they said, yeah, we want you on board if you're willing to be on board. So sure. So at the end of 2014, we started I joined Caffeinated Press. And then a few months later, they decided they wanted a literary journal, which I'd been a fan of literary journals for a long time. Paris Review, McSweeney's, N+1, and the 10,000 other ones that come and go over the years. So I headed that up, and our first issue was light on poetry because nobody had heard of us and we didn't really have a sense of marketing ourselves. And once the first issue came out and we got hooked into Poets and Writers and Duotrope and some of the other places where people can go to look for venues, suddenly we went through from maybe 20 poetry submissions a month to over 100. So suddenly, me being something of a poet and much more a reader of poetry was inundated with all the poetry I could ever hope to read at a volume that was intimidating and at times overwhelming. And two things came of that. One is that it was a tremendous learning experience because I was getting poems from people who are still in high school, people, even people who are in middle school, all the way up to people who had been poets laureate of Oklahoma, or nationally known poets, which immediately I would recognize a name, say that name looks familiar, look this person up, and as a publisher, rather than as a writer, but as a publisher, feel this incredible sense of imposter syndrome. Like, how do we have the audacity to put this person's words in our miserable little journal? Not that it's a miserable journal, but at the time, fresh out of the gate, how do we how do we justify this ego to bring this person into our fold who can only elevate us, and if we do the slightest thing wrong, only lower them? So as a poet, it demystified a lot of things about getting published, because from there I got to know other publishers, other people in the industry, whether poetry specific or, once again, genre fiction, literary fiction, all of that, and realized that under the hood, like on the one hand, you think a place like the New Yorker, or once again the Paris Review, who get tens of thousands of submissions per issue, and how much of that is just the rote work of saying that this one is slightly better than this one, let's put this in this pile, and then the filtering that goes in, and how much of the day-to-day, I've had a bad day, so nobody's poetry is going to be good enough. Or I've had a great day, and this one poem that's really weird and needs a little work, but boy, that hit me in just the right spot, so we're going to include it. And all of our readers that helped us went through the same thing, and that's how we ended up, how we would cobble together an issue. And so that opened the door for me to be able to be comfortable with looking for venues for my own poetry. Not that I had time to write during the 5 years I was part of Caffeinated Press. I probably read 10,000, 15,000 poems in those 5 years, which is exhausting to think about even now. And out of those, we published a few hundred. So it got to be kind of, in addition to the imposter syndrome of like these really good, really talented poets whose careers had been around longer than many of us had been alive, and having to say no to some of their poems because they just didn't fit. There was also, because in West Michigan, the writing community is relatively small for the size of West Michigan and for the population of West Michigan. There isn't a great center like there is Chicago or Detroit or New York or San Francisco, or, so people tend to know people, and getting a submission from somebody I know, somebody who might be a friend, and having to say no was difficult. Also because, all of us were new at publishing, and we hadn't grown the calluses that you necessarily need to have that personal distance. It's nothing personal. This is just business. What you did didn't fit. So sorry, better luck next time. It was, first and foremost, definitely the money. We between the four of us who are the principals of the company, we lost a lot of money. It was all funded out of pocket. We were for-profit, so we were not eligible for grants like NEA grants or the local arts grants. And very few poetry publishers are for-profit, simply because there isn't much profit to be had in poetry. There are a lot of poets. Everybody is reading poetry. Everybody is writing poetry. Everybody is submitting poetry. Everybody is publishing poetry, but there is no money to be had because it all seems to be circulating internally. The idea is that if you're going to submit a poem to someone, you're at least going to pick up a copy of the journal. But if the journal is $20 and you get paid $5, then you're essentially, whether you get paid or not, you're losing money. And there are a large number of poetry venues that simply don't pay. And a publishing credit is great, but if you are a pro, then the places where you're going to make any money are few and far between. So that was half of it, was the money. The other half was marketing. We're all introverts. We don't like talking to people. So getting the word out was difficult, and marketing costs money, which once again, there was not a lot of to spread around. And most of what we had went to rent in our office and all the expenses associated with rent and the publishing costs for the physical, which were not expensive. We went through Ingram Spark, which is pretty good quality. It's the best mix of quality and price we found. It's not expensive, but it's not nothing, especially when you have to print 50 or 100 copies of something to fulfill your, the author copies and distribution to local cafes, things like that. So I met and talked to a lot of poets. There are a lot of supporters, which goes a certain way, just having support. And then yeah, you've got a great thing here. But if you have a lot of supporters who are not actively buying your product, then that's only sustainable for so long. I would have loved for the journal to have been able to keep going. We went from 4 issues a year down to 2 issues a year. At the same time, we narrowed our focus from everywhere, but predominantly the Great Lakes region, and with that, the West Michigan region. When we went from 4 issues a year to 2, we narrowed it down to just West Michigan. And surprisingly, and unfortunately and ironically, that was about the time that we finally had been around enough, several years, that people were, I guess, confident that we'd stick around for a while. So that's when we started getting a lot more of attention from the local poets, like Fable, Christine Krieger, K.T. Herr, Kelsey May, and a great many other poets, local poets, to Grand Rapids. And we managed to publish 2 issues that were all West Michigan, and then we folded. We were all burned out. We were all discouraged from what we perceived as success looking like for a small publisher and for a literary journal, and what we actually had found. And so, I suppose the interest was still there, but it was just unsustainable at that point. There are ways that you can cut costs. One, we didn't need an office. The office was all told about $1,400 a month that could have gone towards other things. So you don't need an office. If you have volunteers, like for your readers, possibly for your editors, that can go a long way towards keeping it sustainable. But if you're going into publishing as a small publisher, a literary publisher, a publisher of poetry, and you're looking to make a profit, the odds of that are vanishingly small. There are small publishers who focus on genre fiction, be it fantasy, sci-fi, horror, romance, Western, who can make a go of it because there is a small dedicated audience who are willing to buy the product as it comes out. Poetry, not that there aren't people who are willing to buy and support the product, but there are so many poetry publishers out there. There are thousands. When we were doing our research for getting the 3288 review up and running, I crunched some numbers, and at that time, just in literary journals which publish poetry in the United States, there are over 1,000 that were active. And how do you get noticed out of 1,000 literary journals, some of which have been running for over 100 years, some of which had the backing of, the literary establishments of, U of M, or, any of the New York universities, or, any of the West Coast literary establishments? How do you make yourself noticed? So in order to do that, we tried to narrow our focus down to West Michigan and do everything specifically West Michigan focused. But once again, just because somebody's from West Michigan doesn't mean that the only thing they're reading is from West Michigan. Their interests are everywhere. Otherwise, and it needs to be, otherwise the community gets a little incestuous, and then you have nobody's reading or doing anything because everything is exactly alike, because everybody's only interacting with people who are within arm's reach. I have a poem that I wrote a couple of years ago, and I try to every year for, I'm generally poetry is kind of in the back of my mind anyway, and I try for National Poetry Month, which is coming up in a few days, write a poem a day. Doesn't have to be good, doesn't have to be anything other than like exercising that muscle every day to kind of keep it current. And this one is, I think, from 2018, maybe 2019, pre-pandemic. And this poem is called Backroad Labyrinth. And this is the first time I've actually read it out loud. There comes a day when a song you haven't heard since popped collars and pegged jeans comes on the radio and knocks something loose you forgot you ever carried. So you go on a road trip, avoiding highways and 4 lanes, the roads through the woods and the farmland, your labyrinth, choosing your turns through half-heard directions from poorly tuned stations full of static and desperation, as you hum along with the tires and sing out loud to the fields and crows. You drive until you find the center when you hear the song again, and it unties the knot in your throat which has been strangling you since you swallowed that anger or envy or lust so many decades ago, before you knew that you can't kill a seed by burying it. And it all comes up and out at once while you're half in a ditch on the side of a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, howling until your ribs ache and your eyes burn and your ears ring with the echoes of empty spaces. And spent and ragged, hollow and worn, you turn on the radio off when you start the car, filling yourself with the unfamiliar silence, and you let the wind through the window guide you on the slow drive home. One of the people, not West Michigan, but another publisher who we published here, Schuler Books, she published a journal called the Eastern Iowa Review, which was lyrical essays, which I'd not really heard of, creative nonfiction, yes, but specifically the lyrical essay. And the work that was in there and her work she sent was just gorgeous. And this was a couple of years after I'd gone on a road trip out to St. Louis, just because it was there. I'd never been. And while I was there, I hopped across to Kansas City to visit an old college friend. Spent the day with him, and then went back across Missouri, which is a really long state to drive across twice in one day. And so, in all that, it was summer, and I had the radio off, and it was, morning when I went west and evening when I went east. And it just, put me in a particular frame of mind with, with the full moon and, thunderstorms on all the horizons and this, emotional thing I'd been, because I hadn't seen my friend Andy in probably 20 years at that point. And so that was the genesis of the road trip idea. The labyrinth part, there is a retreat center up north called the Morning Star Retreat. It's up north of Big Rapids that Scott Krieger and Christine Stevens had introduced me to when they had gone there a couple of times themselves. And I had been through some stuff and went on a 4-day retreat up there just by myself to clear my head and write. And up there, they have a labyrinth, which is the first time I'd ever walked one. I've been through mazes, but a labyrinth is kind of its own thing. And did some studying up on them after I got home, like how labyrinths are used for meditation in many different faiths and spiritual practices. And something of that kind of nurtured something of the road trip I'd been on. They mixed, and that's how that came out. You just hit the road and, pick your auguries of which direction you're going to take, left, right, north, south, east, west, from what's happening around you. And the rules are no CDs. You have to listen to whatever's on the radio when you're in the middle of nowhere, coming in from the stations, the low bandwidth stations, where you can catch every other word and the rest is static. And you can kind of put together a found poem or even an erasure poem, if you're only hearing part of the song that while you're going through the backwoods and the fields, generally northern Michigan. I mean, you can't go too far in northern Michigan because eventually you're going to hit a lake. But for the purposes of this, it sufficed. Well, I've talked to several people about this over the years. Well-established poets, people who have been part of the scene for a long time. Most recently, a few years ago, I had the chance to talk to Todd Kaneko. And before that, I'd kind of asked the same question of Amorak Huey. Was like, there's a lot of poets, but there's no nexus. There's no where's like the cafe scene? Where's the scene that when reading about the beat poets, like you'd always stop in like a particular cafe, a particular bar, and everyone would be there. Where's the place you go where everyone will be there? Back when I was in a writing group in the 90s, that would be the Cottage or Socrates Cafe. Back in the early 90s, or even Kava House back when it existed. But it would be the place where all of the poets, all of the writers would go. And sure, there's a certain part of you want to go there because that's where they are, but there's also I want to go there because maybe somebody will see me writing. Maybe somebody will ask a question about this cool book that I'm reading, like, oh, I've read that, or some way to make that interpersonal connection. And I think that all that happened pre-internet has something to do with it. Like it opened the doors to vast communities of poetry that were available in remote and virtual spaces. But it diminished. Well, I should say, in my experience, it diminished the face-to-face, that delight in like showing up and, hey, there's some people I know who are talking about the thing and I want to go talk to them too. I think there is a tremendous amount of talent. There are a lot of poets in Grand Rapids. There are a lot of very good poets. There are a lot of people who are driven to like spread poetry around. I mean, the Dyer-Ives. The first time I went to the Drunken Retort a few years ago was like, I almost started crying. I was so happy to be in a situation like that for the first time since I think the last reading we had done, the Schuler Books crew at 10 Weston, back when 10 Weston existed. And just that sense of interpersonal, of mutual support, and that just like unbounded love that the people reading there had for each other was not something that, like, it's really hard to experience that online because you're at best as a representation of it and not the thing itself, which can be powerful and it can be good and it can affect you in important ways, but one-on-one human interaction is like there's no substitute for that. So I think in the last few years, with probably a new generation of poets, younger with the drive and with the idea that poetry is a form of connection, is a form of communication, is a form of therapy, is a way to scream at the world that I am here and like this is what I feel and this needs to be known. Like I need you to know that this is me. That I don't know if such a thing was around in the interim between the mid-90s and 2016, 2017, 2018. I lost a few years of being in the scene due to life. So I can't speak for those couple of decades in the middle. But of the people I've made acquaintances with through Caffeinated Press, through people like Kristen Brace, who was part of the Creative Youth Center. I don't think she's part of it anymore. Another wonderful local poet. And Zach Tomaszewski, who worked at the Great Lakes Commonwealth of Letters back when it existed. It seems like almost everything I'm talking about as being important to the poetry scene has closed down or vanished or, just suffered the attrition of time and attention and money and energy. But, that just leaves room for more new things to grow. And from what I can see, as I slowly work my way back into being more involved in the community, there's some really good stuff going on. And I think Grand Rapids could be a great place to be a nexus, a hub of some really good stuff. Just need to get the poets to talk to each other. I think it's going to have to come from younger poets, people who have a life where just, out of a desire to connect and having the freedom of movement to just go find a place to hang out and just, not planned or anything, just hope that somebody shows up. And if not, just do your own thing. Back once again in the pre-internet days, there was a lot more mental space. There was, we weren't inundated with, signals. There was a possibility of being bored. And I think that kind of restlessness, like I need to go do something, is a big part of creating a community like that. And just from seeing what the Dyer-Ives and the associated projects, and this space are doing, I have high hopes. They were a lot of work. They were. It was. There is a mathematician named Douglas Hofstadter who has a rule that says, it's called Hofstadter's rule, and it states that it always takes more time than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's rule. And that was kind of a wake-up call for us. I think this was the first book. This is A Crowd of Sorrows by Lisa Gundry. We published 2 of the poems from here in our first issue down at the bottom of the 3288 review. And she sent us those poems, and we read them, and we knew we had to publish them. And then she sent us the manuscript for the book. And we were just awestruck. Like, even if we need to fund these out of our own pocket, which we did, being the first book, this needs to be published. If not by us, then we need to find somebody who will publish it. And fortunately, Lisa was gracious enough to work with us as we worked through our growing pains and published this. The biggest, there was no skill set that we didn't have. Jason Gillikin, who was the president of Caffeinated Press, he had been an editor. So he had really good chops there. I'd done I had quite a bit of experience editing one-offs, not in any professional capacity, but having been part of writing groups and do my own writing for a long time. The same with Brittany Wilson, who was the third active member of Caffeinated Press. And then we had several other people. We had Tabitha Maloli, Lee Jajuga, who's part of Litmus Press. So more talent there. Elise Wilde, whose poetry is on a couple of the covers here. She also helped us with reading and editing fiction and nonfiction. The big issue was time, because none of us were doing this full time. We all had full-time or more than full-time jobs, families, in Brittany's case, kids. So finding the time to get things done on a schedule particularly the journal when we were 4 times a year, because having a name that starts with an integer, a number, it means it was at the very beginning of the list of the alphabet in any list, and we were a paying market. So which meant that when somebody would like narrow their focus to paying markets, they'd see us, and we played pretty well because we wanted to, be respectful of people's time and effort. We got huge, huge numbers of submissions, all of which had to be read and responded to. And that made it extremely difficult to maintain focus when, after the day job, we would go to the second part-time job. All of us put in a minimum of 20 hours a week at the press. Even when we brought on interns from Grand Valley, any time that we made up by having the interns help with the reading, we lost again because we had to wrangle the interns. That's what they're there for, is to learn. And we didn't want to just, make them our unappreciated help by saying, do this, then go home. We had to make sure that they got a good learning experience out of it too. So yeah, the biggest hurdle was finding the time to do the work of a quality which was respectful of the quality of the work which was sent to us to publish. There are so many.
Oh, that's good to know that there were so many.
There were so many beautiful pieces. One of the things I did, which in all my free time, while I started doing brief interviews through email with the people we published, and I ended up doing 36 of them. They were 7 questions starting. The first one was always, how did you get started writing? And the last question was, what are you working on now? And then I would let the answers to the previous questions guide me through the remaining 5. I forget the poet's name, but she was the poet laureate of Oklahoma when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. So, and unfortunately, I don't think I ever finished the interview with her, but we went back and forth several times talking about what it was like and what in her capacity as poet laureate, how she would respond to such a thing happening in Oklahoma City. And that was an amazing thing because, talking about poetry being, it can be like an appreciation of something beautiful. It can be a way of acknowledging something terrible. It can be, just that raw cry from the heart that you just need to get out of your system. And for her response to that was that was what that was for her and for the people in around her, was how do you express your sadness and horror at something like this happening in the middle of the community. You're right. As one of the first things when I started being involved with the rest of the poets at Schuler Books was all of us got together at someone's house and we watched the documentary Poetry in Motion, which was mostly beat poets and people from around beat poet era. And one of them was, Charles Bukowski. And, I've long since outgrown my Charles Bukowski phase. But there's one thing he said in this documentary which stuck, which is, poetry is what happens when nothing else can. And it's like, if that is such, yes, that exactly. Poetry is what happens when nothing else can. When you have no other way of responding to something, be it being a beautiful thing or a terrible thing, express yourself. If it's poetry, put it into words.